In the most secure prisons in the United States, control begins with restriction. By the mid-20th century, facilities like Folsom State Prison in California and the Federal Penitentiary on Alcatraz Island had developed systems designed to eliminate unpredictability. Movement was regulated. Speech was limited. Contact was controlled. In some cases, individuals spent extended periods in isolation cells no larger than a few square meters. Records from correctional reports and later investigations into prison conditions describe these spaces in consistent terms. Solid doors. Minimal light. Furnishings fixed to the floor or walls. No personal property beyond what was strictly permitted. In these environments, time becomes difficult to measure. At Alcatraz, inmates assigned to D Block, the prison segregation unit, were subjected to stricter confinement than the general population. Some cells, known informally as strip cells, were used for short-term disciplinary isolation. Official accounts confirmed that these cells had limited ventilation, no standard furnishings, and restricted access to light. Clothing and bedding could be withheld under certain disciplinary protocols. The intent was not ambiguous. Isolation was used as a tool of compliance. At Folsom, a state facility with a different administrative structure but similar security priorities, segregation units served a comparable function. Inmates who violated institutional rules or were considered security risks could be removed from the general population and placed under continuous observation. Daily routines were reduced to their most basic elements. Meals were delivered through slots. Communication was restricted to brief, regulated exchanges. Physical movement was limited to short, supervised intervals, if permitted at all. Academic studies conducted decades later, examining archival prison records and first-hand accounts, would identify consistent psychological effects associated with prolonged isolation. These included heightened anxiety, difficulty concentrating, and disturbances in perception. These findings were not part of official policy at the time, but the conditions themselves were documented. In Alcatraz, which operated as a federal penitentiary from 1934 to 1963, the design of the facility reinforced constant surveillance. The prison was constructed to maintain clear sight lines. Cell blocks were arranged in tiers, allowing guards to observe multiple rows simultaneously. Movement between areas required passing through controlled gates, each operated manually. The architecture limited opportunity, but it did not eliminate it. Despite the restrictions, escape attempts were recorded at both institutions. At Alcatraz, the Federal Bureau of Prisons documented 14 separate escape attempts involving 36 inmates over the course of its operation. Most were unsuccessful. In many cases, individuals were apprehended before leaving the island. Others were shot during the attempt. Some were later confirmed to have drowned in the waters surrounding the facility. The official position remains that no one successfully escaped from Alcatraz and survived. At Folsom, escape attempts occurred under different circumstances. As a land-based facility, the challenges were not defined by water, but by perimeter security, armed patrols, and layered barriers. Historical records from the California Department of Corrections indicate multiple incidents in which inmates attempted to breach walls, manipulate work assignments, or exploit moments of reduced supervision. Each attempt required planning. Each plan had to account for routine. Routine was the constant. Wake-up times. Head counts. Work assignments. Meal distribution. Lights out. The repetition was deliberate. It created predictability. And within predictability, patterns could be observed. In documented cases across multiple institutions, individuals who attempted escape often relied on extended periods of observation. Court records and investigative reports describe methods that included studying guard rotations, identifying structural weaknesses, and accumulating small, permitted items over time. There was no single profile. Some individuals acted alone. Others coordinated in small groups. What they shared was exposure to the same controlled environment. An environment where autonomy was minimal. Where decisions were made externally. Where movement required authorization. Over time, adaptation occurred. This adaptation was not theoretical. It is reflected in documented behaviors: compliance during observation, silence when necessary, and attention to detail within the confines of daily routine. In Alcatraz, inmates worked in assigned roles: laundry, kitchen duty, maintenance. These assignments were structured, supervised, and recorded. But they also created limited access to tools, materials, and spaces beyond the cell. Access was controlled, but it existed. At Folsom, similar labor systems were in place. Work assignments were part of institutional operation. They also introduced variability into otherwise rigid schedules. Variability created opportunity, not freedom, but possibility. In official reports following escape attempts, investigators often reconstructed timelines based on these routines. They examined how individuals moved through the system, where they were positioned, what they had access to, and how long they remained unobserved. These reconstructions reveal a consistent reality. Escapes did not begin at the moment of action. They began long before. In silence. In observation. In the accumulation of small, seemingly insignificant details. A loose vent. A tool left unsecured. A routine that did not change. Inside isolation cells, where time stretched and interaction was minimal, the absence of external stimulus could intensify focus on internal processes. Some inmates documented their experiences in later interviews or memoirs, describing heightened awareness of sound, light, and structural features of their surroundings. These accounts vary, but they align on one point. Attention narrows. In environments designed to control every variable, even minor irregularities become noticeable. And once noticed, they are not easily ignored. If you're following this documentary, consider subscribing to continue exploring these documented realities as they unfold, one verified account at a time. Because what emerges from these records is not a story of sudden action. It is a record of slow preparation, measured in days, in months. In maximum security prisons, planning is constrained by structure. Every action takes place within a system designed to observe and regulate behavior. At both Folsom State Prison and the Federal Penitentiary at Alcatraz, institutional design limited unsupervised movement and reduced opportunities for concealment. But within these limits, certain forms of preparation were still possible. Historical investigations into escape attempts consistently show that planning relied on routine access rather than sudden opportunity. Inmates did not operate outside the system. They worked within it, using what was available through assigned duties and daily movement. At Alcatraz, work assignments were a central part of prison operation. Inmates were selected for specific roles based on conduct and institutional needs. These roles included kitchen work, laundry services, maintenance, and other forms of labor necessary to sustain the facility. Each assignment came with defined responsibilities. It also came with controlled access to tools. Federal records indicate that tools were inventoried and monitored. Counts were conducted before and after work shifts. Missing equipment triggered immediate searches. These procedures were documented and enforced. Despite this, some escape attempts involved the gradual misuse of authorized tools. Not through overt theft, but through concealment over time. In the 1962 escape attempt involving inmates Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin, later detailed in FBI investigations, the individuals assigned to cells in the same block exploited structural features of the facility. Their plan did not rely on force against guards or rapid movement through secured areas. It relied on alteration. Over a period of months, they used improvised tools to widen existing ventilation openings located at the rear of their cells. These openings, originally designed for airflow, were not intended for passage. However, the concrete surrounding them was susceptible to gradual wear. Investigative reports describe how the individuals used items such as metal spoons, reinforced with materials obtained from within the prison, to chip away at the concrete. The process was slow and conducted during evening hours when ambient noise from the cell block masked minor sounds. To avoid detection, they constructed false coverings for the openings. These coverings were made from materials including cardboard and paint, designed to match the surrounding wall. During inspections, the altered sections appeared intact under routine observation. The planning extended beyond the cell itself. Above the cell block was an unguarded utility corridor. Access to this area was not intended for inmates, but the structural design made it reachable once the ventilation openings were enlarged sufficiently. From there, movement through the facility required further navigation of restricted spaces. The escape plan incorporated each of these stages, not as isolated actions, but as parts of a continuous process. At Folsom State Prison, documented escape attempts followed different patterns due to the facility's layout. Without the geographic isolation of an island, perimeter security was the primary barrier. High walls, guard towers, and armed patrols formed multiple layers of containment. Escape attempts often involved efforts to breach or bypass these barriers. In some recorded cases, inmates concealed themselves in transport vehicles or work-related equipment. In others, individuals attempted to scale walls using improvised means. Each method required knowledge of timing, guard rotations, shift changes, moments when visibility might be reduced. This information was not publicly available within the institution, but it could be observed. Over time, inmates assigned to outdoor labor or maintenance roles had limited exposure to areas closer to the perimeter. While still under supervision, these assignments introduced visual access to security structures. Patterns could be noted, not documented in writing, but retained. Correctional reports from the period emphasized the importance of unpredictability in maintaining security. Irregular patrols, random searches, and unannounced inspections were implemented to disrupt pattern recognition. Even so, absolute unpredictability was not achievable. Institutions operate on schedules. Schedules create consistency. Consistency over extended periods can be studied. In the case of Alcatraz, the 1962 escape attempt demonstrated how accumulated observations could be translated into coordinated action. The individuals involved synchronized their efforts without direct communication during critical phases. Timing was based on shared understanding of routine rather than real-time coordination. This reduced the need for visible interaction, which reduced the risk of detection. Their preparation included the creation of dummy heads, placed in their beds to simulate occupancy during nighttime checks. These objects were constructed using materials available within the prison, including soap, paper, and human hair collected from the barbershop. Only enough to delay immediate discovery. Official investigations confirmed that the absence of the inmates was not detected until morning count. By that time they had already moved beyond the cell block. At Folsom, similar reliance on delay tactics appears in documented cases. Escape attempts often included efforts to create temporary confusion or misdirection. These did not need to be complex. They only needed to create a gap, a short interval between action and response. Within that interval, distance could be gained. Distance, in these contexts, was measured in meters, in seconds, not miles, because initial containment zones were immediate. Response protocols were activated quickly. Alarms, lockdowns, search procedures. These systems were designed to minimize the window of opportunity, and in many cases they were effective. Most escape attempts at both institutions did not succeed. Individuals were apprehended within the facility or shortly after breaching initial barriers. Official records document outcomes including recapture, injury, or death during the attempt. They reflect the difficulty of overcoming layered security systems. But they also reflect the persistence of attempts. Despite conditions of confinement. Despite the risks. Despite the limited probability of success. If you're following this investigation into real prison escapes, consider subscribing to continue as each documented case is examined in detail, based on verified records and official findings. On the night of June 11, 1962, operations inside the federal penitentiary at Alcatraz followed their standard sequence. Evening counts had been completed. Cells were secured. Lighting was reduced according to established procedure. The institution entered its nighttime phase, a period defined by minimal movement and periodic checks. According to official reports from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Bureau of Prisons, inmates Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin were present in their assigned cells during the final count. Nothing in the record indicates immediate irregularity. At some point after lockdown, each of the three individuals initiated the final stage of a plan that had been in preparation for months. The ventilation openings at the rear of their cells, previously altered through gradual effort, were now large enough to permit passage. The openings were located beneath the sinks, partially obscured from direct line of sight. Investigative documentation confirms that the inmates removed the coverings they had constructed to conceal the modifications. They then exited their cells through these openings. The timing was consistent with periods when ambient noise levels were higher, reducing the likelihood of detection from minor sounds. Once through the openings, they entered an unoccupied utility corridor situated behind the cell block. This corridor was not routinely patrolled. Its existence was known within the structural design of the building, but it was not intended for inmate access. Movement within this space allowed them to bypass the primary observation lines of the cell house. From there, they ascended through the facility using exposed piping and structural supports. Reports indicate that the route led them to the roof area above the cell block. Access points to the roof were not designed for inmate use, but the absence of continuous monitoring in these specific zones created a limited pathway. Upon reaching the roof, they navigated across the structure to a rear section of the building. This area was less visible from guard positions compared to the main yard-facing sections. The descent from the roof required additional coordination. The individuals used a makeshift rope, assembled from materials including prison-issued raincoats. These items had been collected over time and repurposed into a functional cord. The rope was anchored to structural elements on the roof. From there, they lowered themselves to the ground level outside the main cell house. This movement placed them within the prison perimeter, but outside the immediate confines of the cell block. The next phase involved reaching the shoreline. Alcatraz Island is surrounded by cold, fast-moving water in the San Francisco Bay. Official records note that water temperatures typically range between 50 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Currents in the area are strong and variable. These environmental factors were well documented at the time. They were also central to the institution's security model. The prevailing assumption, supported by earlier escape attempts, was that the water itself functioned as a natural barrier. The three individuals proceeded toward the northeastern shoreline of the island. Investigators later determined that they had constructed an improvised flotation device, also using raincoats sealed and assembled to retain air. The construction of this device was detailed in FBI reports, based on recovered materials and reconstruction of the escape method. At some point during the night, they entered the water. The exact time is not recorded. No direct observation of this moment exists in official accounts. By the time the absence was discovered, the individuals were no longer on the island. Morning count revealed the discrepancy. Correctional officers conducting routine checks noticed that the individuals in the cells were unresponsive. Further inspection revealed that the figures in the beds were not occupants, but constructed forms. These forms, later examined, were found to be fabricated using available materials, including soap and paper, shaped and painted to resemble human features. Hair collected from the prison barbershop had been applied to enhance realism. The purpose was confirmed as a delay mechanism. It was effective. The delay allowed additional time between the point of exit and the initiation of search procedures. Once the absence was confirmed, standard response protocols were activated. The prison was placed on lockdown. Search teams were deployed across the island. External agencies, including the Coast Guard, were notified. Search operations extended into the surrounding waters. Debris associated with the escape was later recovered. This included parts of the improvised flotation device and personal items identified as belonging to the individuals. No confirmed trace of the three men was found beyond these materials. The official investigation concluded that the most probable outcome was drowning. This conclusion was based on environmental conditions, absence of confirmed sightings, and lack of physical evidence indicating successful arrival on the mainland. However, the case remains formally open. No definitive proof of death has been established through recovered remains. The Federal Bureau of Investigation closed its active investigation in 1979, transferring jurisdiction to the U.S. Marshals Service, which maintains the case as unresolved. This status reflects the absence of conclusive evidence, not confirmation of survival. The escape from Alcatraz on June 11, 1962, remains one of the most extensively documented prison escapes in U.S. history. Its significance is not based on confirmed success, but on the method, on the ability to navigate a system designed to prevent exactly this outcome. The planning relied on observation. The execution relied on timing. The environment imposed limits that could not be fully controlled. If you are following this documented examination of real prison escapes, consider subscribing to continue as the investigation moves beyond the island and into the response, the search, and the long-term implications recorded in official findings. Because once the movement begins, control shifts from the institution to uncertainty. And in that transition, the limits of confinement are tested against conditions that cannot be fully predicted or contained. The outcome in this case remains unverified, and that uncertainty continues to define the record. In the days following the June 1962 escape from Alcatraz, the response extended beyond the island. Search operations were conducted across the surrounding waters of the San Francisco Bay. The United States Coast Guard deployed vessels to scan for signs of movement or debris. Shorelines were inspected. Nearby islands were checked. Nothing was found that confirmed arrival. Only fragments. Official reports document the recovery of items believed to be associated with the escape. Among them were sections of the improvised flotation device, constructed from prison-issued raincoats. These materials were located in the water, not on land. Their condition suggested exposure to currents, but not duration. Personal items were also recovered. A wallet containing identification linked to one of the Anglin brothers was found in the bay. Photographs inside were intact. The wallet itself showed signs of water damage. No bodies were recovered. This absence shaped the investigation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation led the case for 17 years. Their findings, compiled in reports released after the investigation concluded in 1979, reflect a consistent assessment. Given the water temperature estimated between 50 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, and the strength of the currents in the San Francisco Bay, survival without immediate rescue was considered unlikely. This assessment was based on documented environmental data and prior cases involving exposure to similar conditions. It was not based on direct evidence of death. No physical remains were found. No confirmed sightings were verified. The case did not close with certainty. It was transferred to the United States Marshals Service, where it remains open under standard protocol for unresolved fugitive cases. Over the decades, additional claims and reports emerged. Some were investigated. Most were dismissed due to lack of verifiable evidence. In 2013, a letter surfaced, reportedly written by an individual claiming to be John Anglin. The letter was analyzed by federal authorities. Its authenticity was not confirmed. The investigation into the letter did not produce conclusive results. Such developments did not alter the official position. The outcome remains undetermined. At Folsom State Prison, escape attempts followed a different trajectory. Unlike Alcatraz, which ceased operation in 1963, Folsom continues to function as an active correctional institution. Over its history, documented escape attempts have been investigated and recorded through state correctional reports. Most resulted in recapture. In several cases, individuals were apprehended within hours or days. Others were located after longer periods, often through coordinated law enforcement efforts. The outcomes were documented with clarity. Arrest records, court proceedings, return to custody. These records reflect a system that, while challenged, maintained operational continuity. In both institutions, escape attempts prompted procedural reviews. Security measures were reassessed. Structural vulnerabilities were addressed. At Alcatraz, the 1962 escape contributed to broader evaluations of the facility's operational cost and infrastructure. While not the sole factor, these assessments were part of the decision-making process that led to the prison's closure the following year. At Folsom, adjustments were incremental. Policy changes, infrastructure reinforcement, increased monitoring. These responses were recorded in administrative updates and correctional policy revisions. The pattern is consistent. An attempt occurs. The system responds. Adaptation follows. But the underlying conditions remain. Controlled movement, restricted autonomy, structured routine. These elements define the environment in which both confinement and escape attempts exist. The historical record does not present escape as a common outcome. It presents it as a rare event. One that requires extended preparation. One that operates within narrow margins. And one that, in most cases, does not succeed. What remains in the case of Alcatraz is not confirmation. It is absence. No verified endpoint. No definitive conclusion. Only a sequence of documented actions that end at the shoreline. Beyond that point, the record becomes incomplete. If you have followed this documentary, you have moved through verified accounts drawn from official investigations, correctional records, and documented evidence. If you find value in this kind of fact-based examination, you can support the work by subscribing, sharing, or leaving a comment with your perspective or questions. Because these records continue to exist, unchanged, unresolved in some cases, and still open to examination, not as stories, but as documented events that reflect the limits and realities of institutional control. The files remain, the evidence remains, and in some cases the outcome does not.